Why is the US desperately keeping Chinese cars out of its borders? Not long ago, after returning to the US, Donald Trump answered a reporter's question. He mentioned that he might allow Chinese cars into the US, provided certain tariffs were added. He then followed up by saying his tariff policies had protected the American auto market, adding, "Look at Europe. It is finished." It seemed like Trump was wavering a bit, prompting American conservatives to instantly shout, "Mr. President, absolutely not." Alright, today, let's dive into a highly informative topic about the free American market. The big question we are unpacking is this: why is the United States absolutely terrified of letting Chinese cars cross its borders? If you ask Washington politicians about this, or flip through the wire reports of mainstream Western media, or even listen to famous influencers, they will tell you in a deeply distressed tone, Chinese automakers are heavily subsidized by their government. They are dumping products, and they are destroying fair competition in America's free market. Or they'll simply pull out the ultimate wildcard, national security, and claim that Chinese EVs aren't just cars. They are essentially spy machines on wheels that will beam Americans' private data back to Beijing, meaning they'll know every single move you make. However, none of this is the actual truth. It is purely a fig leaf for a sore loser who can't win the game and decides to play dirty. Why is that? Today, let's break it down in detail. Escalating a Cold War style ban. First off, any commentator who oversimplifies the logic of the global auto industry, one of the world's most critical, top-tier sectors, is basically just reading off a script. And where do these scripts come from? Japanese think tanks, or those of BMW and Mercedes Benz. In reality, the core reason the US is pulling out all the stops, completely throwing shame out the window to block Chinese cars, has absolutely nothing to do with fair trade or national security. It is a full-blown defensive war fueled by industry anxiety, electoral politics, and a desperate struggle for control over the future of manufacturing. In other words, America, the nation that literally put the world on wheels, is looking in its rearview mirror at China's skyrocketing automotive progress and is flat out terrified. That is all it is. Today, we are going to trace the historical script and clearly break down the underlying logic of this American ban, along with its deeply ironic historical parallels. To understand this narrative, we still have to talk about Trump and Joe Biden, especially Biden. To see why Americans are so panicked, we first need to look at just how tightly they have shut the door against Chinese automobiles. In recent years, US tactics against Chinese cars have escalated significantly, bordering on hysterical. When we talk about building a wall against Chinese vehicles, we have to point to the Biden administration. This aggressive containment is a product of his term. That is why many insiders in the Chinese auto industry deeply dislike Biden, and rumor has it some even quietly rooted for Trump during the US election. While these are just industry rumors and can't be verified, if true, their sentiment is completely understandable. In 2024, the Biden administration abruptly jacked up tariffs on Chinese EVs from 25% to a staggering 100%, which was an insane move. Why was it so absurd? Many people assume tariffs just add to the price, and that even if you double the cost, Chinese cars would still be much cheaper than American-made ones. After all, for a vehicle of comparable quality, American manufacturing costs are often more than 4 times higher than China's. But the auto sector doesn't work that way. Even without tariffs, cars are a heavily protected industry in the US, subject to all kinds of miscellaneous compliance fees. Let's look at a hypothetical example from the Biden era. Take a Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, strip away the tariffs, and modify it to be completely street legal for the US market. By the time you slap on that 100% punitive tariff, add ocean freight, and factor in safety compliance costs, the final sticker price skyrockets to around $40,000. This is a car that originally sells for under 50,000 RMB, around $7,000, in China. Selling it in the US makes it roughly 7 times more expensive. A tiny, budget commuter car from China gets artificially inflated into the price bracket of a mid-size sedan in America, which is downright comical. From high tariffs to absolute bans, Biden's connected vehicle rule. But notice that up to this point, the US approach was still a transactional tariff game. A 100% tariff means everything is still fundamentally about money. As long as you are willing to pay that exorbitant toll, or if Chinese automakers are willing to build factories in the US, hire American blue-collar workers, and pay us taxes, a deal could theoretically be struck. Trump's administration, in particular, favored tariffs to explicitly revitalize American manufacturing and push supply chains back to the US mainland, which directly appeals to working-class voters looking for job security. But Joe Biden operates on an entirely different playbook. As a veteran of Washington politics, why would he settle for a basic tariff strategy? Biden figured that high tariffs weren't a foolproof barrier. What if Chinese automakers were willing to take a loss or managed to sneak into the US market by taking a detour through Mexico? To him, that was a terrifying loophole that defied his containment strategy. So, Biden decided to go all the way and eliminate any loophole whatsoever. In January 2025, right before leaving office, his administration scrambled to push through a bill known as the Connected Vehicle Rule, targeting China. They feared that an incoming Trump administration might suddenly waver and let Chinese cars in, which would crush America's close allies, like the Japanese automakers. This rule, along with an outbound investment restriction bill, was signed in the final hour of his presidency, precisely to box the incoming administration in and prevent any future automotive cooperation with China. This overnight regulatory rule is sweeping. It dictates that any vehicle incorporating software or hardware connected to China, especially advanced connected functions or infotainment platforms, is permanently banned from the US market. It's a brilliant but ruthless political maneuver. Biden knew that flat-out banning affordable cars would frustrate American consumers who wonder why they are forced to buy overpriced vehicles. So, he reframed the narrative around data connectivity rather than trade. But let's be real, what modern EV isn't connected to the internet? What modern car doesn't run on complex software? By shifting the goalpost to software security, he effectively engineered a total physical shutout of Chinese passenger vehicles. Furthermore, this containment leaves zero blind spots. It doesn't just block fully assembled vehicles exported from China. It actively plugs backdoors through Mexico or Canada. Even if a car belongs to a European brand and is manufactured in Mexico, it faces an immediate ban if it contains Chinese-developed smart cockpit software or autonomous driving hardware. In this framework, automobiles are no longer commodities or businesses. They are battlegrounds for a zero-sum decoupling. To the Washington establishment, Chinese cars are treated like mobile strategic assets. If a vehicle runs on a single line of code written by a programmer in China, the US national security apparatus views it as a critical threat, the ultimate platform for the next industrial revolution. However, if you think Washington politicians are tracking Chinese cars just because they are worried about Detroit losing a bit of market share, you are missing the bigger picture. Let's look a layer deeper. What exactly is a modern electric vehicle, EV at its core? During Detroit's golden age, a car was simply a chassis, an internal combustion engine, and 4 seats. Today, a high-end EV is the ultimate convergence of an automotive shell, a massive battery pack, AI large models, advanced semiconductor chips, complex operating systems, embodied intelligence, and a mobile energy grid terminal. Let's look at the data. According to McKinsey's report on software-defined vehicles in the traditional legacy ICE era, mechanical components accounted for the lion's share of a vehicle's value, roughly 70%, while electronics made up only 30%. In today's EVs, electronics, batteries, and software systems approach or exceed 50% of the total value. By the time Level 4 autonomous driving becomes standard, McKinsey estimates that software's share of a large passenger vehicle's value will jump from around 10% today to nearly 30% by 2030. Meanwhile, a Boston consulting group, BCG report, estimates that by 2030, software-defined vehicles will unlock over $650 billion in industry value, commanding 15 to 20% of the entire global automotive value pool. Do you see the catch now? An EV is no longer just a car. It is a super robot on wheels, an AI agent navigating the physical world. What truly panics American elites is that China is turning the automobile into the ultimate platform for the next industrial revolution. If Chinese cars take over American streets, it means Chinese semiconductors, operating systems, AI algorithms, and digital ecosystems will integrate into the daily lives of American consumers. This airtight ban isn't about blocking cheap commuter cars. It's an attempt to defend the final gateway to the future of heavy industry. Granted, this might not all be a master plan by Biden himself. It's likely just a standard institutional path, dependency pushing for isolation. But facing this level of protectionism, we have to ask, how did the United States, a country that lectured the world on free trade and open markets, suddenly pivot to an isolationist, closed-door policy reminiscent of the old Qing dynasty? The answer is simple. Confronted with an immense generational technology gap, legacy American automakers are completely defenseless in an open market. Their only recourse is to rely on political barbed wire to shelter domestic industrial dinosaurs that remain addicted to the high profit margins of gas-powered vehicles. History repeats itself. The sovereignty-level neutering of Japanese cars 40 years ago. For anyone familiar with automotive history, this playbook looks incredibly familiar. The exact strategy deployed against Chinese cars today is a carbon copy of what Washington did to Japanese imports 40 years ago. To truly grasp where China stands today, we have to open the historical ledger and look at how Japanese automakers originally navigated a deeply protectionist US market. Let's wind the clock back to the 1970 seconds. Back then, American giants like GM, Ford, and Chrysler ruled the world. They specialized in gas-guzzling, V8 powered, boat-sized muscle cars. To the American consumer of that era, a real car had to be massive, loud, and thirsty for fuel. That was the definition of the American dream. Then came 1973 and 1979, and the global order suffered two massive shocks. The oil crises. Overnight, global oil prices quadrupled. Americans driving their heavy V8 suddenly found themselves stranded or waiting in mile-long lines at gas stations. Those endless queues became the defining image of that era's economic anxiety. As American consumers, panicking over soaring gas prices, grew desperate, Detroit's executives sat on inventories of unsellable muscle cars. With Chrysler sliding toward bankruptcy, Japanese automakers saw their golden opportunity. Before the crisis, brands like Toyota and Honda were dismissed by Americans as cheap, flimsy tin toys. But Japanese cars possessed one massive advantage. They were engineered for compact, highly fuel efficient, and incredibly durable performance. This exact value proposition perfectly aligned with a sudden desperate American demand for affordable daily commuters. Driven by the pain at the pump, American consumers swallowed their pride and began buying Japanese imports in droves. Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics flooded American suburbs. On the back of three simple traits: fuel efficiency, affordability, and reliability, Japan broke open the US market during a geopolitical crisis. But did American industrialists just sit back and accept the verdict of the free market? Not a chance. History shows that when the US struggles to outcompete a rival under existing rules, it doesn't self-reflect, it rewrites the rules. Honestly, from a pure realpolitik perspective, this power-based approach to trade and diplomacy is textbook superpower behavior. By the 1980 seconds, with Japanese imports routing domestic brands, Washington intervened. Politicians unleashed a highly effective sequence of policy strikes that fundamentally crippled the Japanese auto industry's upward trajectory. To start off, they hit them with what they called voluntary export restraints. In 1981, Washington essentially held a metaphorical gun to Tokyo's head, forcing Japan to sign an agreement, voluntarily capping its auto exports to the US at 1.68 million units per year. The term voluntary remains one of the greatest ironies in modern trade history. It boils down to, I can't beat you in the market, so you must voluntarily sell less to me. So much for free market principles. Next up, they rolled out the Plaza Accord. Capping volume wasn't enough. Washington needed to destroy Japan's cost advantage. In 1985, the US, alongside the UK, France, and West Germany, pressured Japan into signing the Plaza Accord, causing the Japanese yen to skyrocket against the US dollar. Overnight, the exchange rate weapon erased the price advantage of Japanese cars. The Accord's broader impact ended up bursting Japan's entire asset bubble. But its immediate effect on autos was devastating. And then came the final blow, which was forced localization. Washington made a calculated demand. If Japanese brands wanted to sell cars to Americans, they had to build them in America, leaving the jobs, the taxes, and the supply chains on US soil. Under intense political pressure, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan opened major manufacturing plants in states like Ohio and Texas. By 1989, vehicles produced by Japanese transplants on US soil accounted for 40% of domestic production. This strategy amounted to a sovereignty level, neutering of a commercial rival. Through political muscle, currency manipulation, and trade leverage, the US tamed a highly aggressive competitor, turning it into an economic client, integrated into the US domestic footprint. Japan had no choice but to comply because it remains geopolitically and militarily dependent on the United States. When your security is held by someone else, it doesn't matter how efficient your factories are. You ultimately accept the leash, kicking away the ladder and China's 6 aces. Tode, seeing the US lean so hard into protectionism with triple-digit tariffs, some academic purists lament that America is betraying its own free trade ideals, blaming it all on political anomalies like Trump. This view is incredibly naive. If you examine American economic history, this isn't a departure from tradition. It is a return to their founding playbook. America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, famously authored the report on Manufacturers Underscore, its core philosophy, pure protectionism. Hamilton argued that a young United States could not survive free trade with the global industrial hegemon of the time, Great Britain. He championed high tariffs to shield America's nascent, infant industries. During Abraham Lincoln's presidency, the U.S. pushed tariffs to historic highs, using aggressive trade barriers to incubate the American Industrial Revolution. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. maintained some of the highest average tariff rates in the world. This is the ultimate historical irony. The U.S. built its industrial supremacy on extreme protectionism. Yet, once it climbed to the top of the global ladder, it flipped the narrative, evangelizing the gospel of free trade and forcing other nations to open their doors via gunboat diplomacy. In economics, this is known as kicking away the ladder. You climb to the roof using protectionism, kick the ladder down, and tell everyone on the ground, ladders are banned. You must figure out how to fly up here through free trade. Strangely, many still praise this as the true American spirit of free enterprise. So today, when China leverages its end-to-end supply chain dominance to leapfrog the US in the EV race, Washington realizes it can no longer win under the rules of free trade. Without hesitation, they drop the pretense, dig into the basement, and bring back the Hamiltonian and Lincolnian ladder of protectionism. Don't blame American politicians for looking hypocritical. They are simply reacting to deep industrial anxiety by reverting to their oldest playbook. Understanding how the US brought Japanese automakers to heel leads many to draw parallels to China's EV rise. Some Washington hawks, like Marco Rubio, arrogantly believe that a fresh round of tariff pressure and political intimidation can tame BYD and Kettle the same way they tamed Toyota. That is an absolute delusion based on outdated thinking. The fundamental drivers behind China's automotive rise belong to an entirely different dimension. First, the momentum is completely different. Japan's rise was accelerated by external crises. China's rise is driven by a structural technological generation gap. Japan entered the US market by capitalizing on the 1970s oil shocks, a geopolitical stroke of luck that met a temporary consumer need for basic, fuel-efficient transportation. China's automotive industry, by contrast, relies on absolute technological and cost performance superiority across the core EV stack: batteries, electric motors, electronic controls, smart cockpits, and autonomous driving algorithms. Chinese EVs don't depend on oil spikes to look attractive, even without energy market disruptions. Chinese vehicles deliver a structural blow to traditional combustion engines through superior intelligence and massive cost efficiencies. Faced with this crushing cost-to-performance ratio, Western media and Washington politicians always default to the same talking point. Chinese cars are only cheap because of massive government subsidies. It is unfair competition. That is pure cope from uncompetitive players. If cutting government checks alone could engineer a world-class industrial superpower, Saudi Arabia and the UAE would dominate global manufacturing by now. In reality, China's ability to drive down costs to levels that drive Western automakers to despair rests on 6 structural advantages that the West simply cannot replicate. For starters, you have unrivaled economies of scale. China boasts the world's largest single automotive market, with annual production and sales figures hovering around 30 million vehicles. In heavy manufacturing, volume is king. When your production scale dwarfs competitors, the fixed costs of R&D and tooling amortized across each vehicle drop to near zero. On top of that, there is the hyper-localized supply chain radius. Building an EV in Europe often involves sourcing batteries from Germany, seats from Poland, and wiring harnesses from Romania. This cross-border juggling adds immense logistics overhead. In China, over 90% of a vehicle's components, from the battery pack and drivetrain to the glass, tires, and semiconductors, can be sourced within a 500-kilometer radius of the assembly plant. It is an unmatched feat of logistical efficiency. Then, you have to look at their hyper-efficient manufacturing. Look at Tesla's Shanghai Gigafactory or BYD's production lines, gigacastings, cell-to-body integration, and massive robotic automation. In these advanced megaplants, a brand new vehicle can roll off the line roughly every minute. This level of throughput is structurally impossible under Western Union constraints. And it doesn't stop there. They also have a massive engineering dividend. China produces and employs the largest pool of automotive R&D and software engineers in the world, providing a deep talent bench that accelerates product life cycles. Next up is their absolute battery hegemony. Allied by giants like CATL and BYD, China doesn't just assemble batteries, it dominates the upstream refining and processing of anodes, cathodes, separators, and electrolytes. Without access to Chinese processed materials, Western battery gigafactories cannot function. Finally, the real kicker is the world's most ruthless domestic colosseum. This is the ultimate crucible. China's EV competitiveness wasn't built by a cozy, state-backed monopoly. It is the product of dozens of cutthroat brands fighting a brutal war of attrition in the domestic market. This intense pressure forces rapid software iterations and relentless cost reductions. As long as this ultra-competitive ecosystem persists, Western or Japanese legacy brands stand little chance of catching up. The US at least has Tesla, and there should be mutual respect between American and Chinese innovation. But when it comes to Japan, the lingering internet obsession with their legacy dominance is puzzling. Outside of their protected share in the US market, what structural advantages do they have left? These 6 aces are the true code behind the disruptive value of Chinese EVs trading spaces, corporate hypocrisy, and the endgame. Let's look at the macroeconomic data. In 2025, China's automotive production reached 34.53 million units. Sales hit 34.40 million units, and exports climbed to 7.09 million units. This marked 17 consecutive years of global leadership in auto production and sales. This isn't a flash-in-the-pan success by a single company. It is a massive industrial ecosystem exporting capacity, branding, and technology worldwide. From upstream lithium processing to midstream cell manufacturing and downstream assembly, Chinese firms hold immense pricing power. According to the IEA, China commands roughly 70% of global EV production, over 80% of battery cell capacity, 85% of cathode materials, and over 90% of anode materials. Crucially, China is a sovereign superpower. Washington could force Tokyo to sign the Plaza Accord and accept export restrictions, but it lacks the leverage or capability to force an industrial capitulation package onto Beijing. There is a poetic irony here that matches the old proverb. The very instrument of your rise will be the cause of your fall. Japanese automakers originally captured the US market by offering smart, fuel-efficient alternatives during an oil crisis. Today, their historical success in combustion engines has left them saddled with inertia, making them slow to adapt to electrification and software-defined architectures. Now, brands like Toyota and Honda find themselves losing ground to American and Chinese EV technologies on the global stage, while the US approach relies on blunt protectionism. Shifting our gaze to Europe reveals a corporate comedy of errors. Specifically, the corporate dissonance within the German auto industry. Why can Washington weld the door shut without missing a beat? Because Detroit brands like Ford and GM have already been marginalized in the Chinese domestic market. They have very little skin left in the game. But look at the German big three, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW. They are caught in a classic corporate dilemma. On one hand, watching Chinese EVs arrive in Europe terrifies them, prompting frantic lobbying in Brussels for anti-subsidy duties. On the other hand, their financial statements tell a sobering story. Nearly a third of Volkswagen's global sales are tied to Chinese buyers, and a massive chunk of Mercedes and BMW profits come straight from China's middle class. This creates a hostage capital scenario. If European regulators push Beijing too hard, targeted counter-tariffs could instantly crater German balance sheets. As a result, European executives pivot constantly, preaching protectionism at home while praising open trade during trips to Beijing. Moreover, the US strategy contains a deep layer of corporate hypocrisy. Consider Tesla, the crown jewel of American EV innovation and the world's most valuable automaker. China is its fiercest competitor, but it is also its indispensable lifeline. Look at the manufacturing economics. Tesla constantly promotes the cost competitiveness of the Model 3 and Model Y, yet its most efficient, highest margin facility is Gigafactory Shanghai. When you disassemble an American-branded Model 3, the battery components, electric drive units, and precision stampings are overwhelmingly sourced from Chinese suppliers. Tesla achieves its optimized cost structures precisely by plugging directly into the industrial base of the Yangtze River Delta. This highlights the central contradiction of US policy. The administration constructs elaborate legal frameworks to ban Chinese automotive brands, while domestic industry champions rely heavily on the Chinese component ecosystem to preserve global competitiveness. It's like banning Chinese restaurant signs, because local diners prefer the food and prices, while local kitchens continue to buy their woks, spices, and prep talent from the exact same source. Washington is effectively banning a badge, while the underlying architecture of the Western EV transition remains deeply intertwined with Chinese manufacturing. Believing that political containment can fully wall off this manufacturing shift is short-sighted. The supply chain integration operates through thousands of Tier 1 and Tier 2 components worldwide. Projections suggest Chinese brands could secure 30% of the global auto market by 2030. Facing this headwind, the US can attempt to build an island out of North America, but that policy will simply push Chinese brands to scale faster across Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. If the global automotive standard adapts to this ecosystem, an isolated US auto industry risks being left out of global innovation loops, turning into a subsidized regional enclave. Even neighboring Canada has seen rapid consumer adoption of imported EV models. This brings us to the ultimate endgame. Will Chinese automotive technology ever enter the US market? The answer is clear. It's not a question of underscore if underscore, but underscore and underscore and underscore how underscore. Realpolitik doesn't operate on wishful thinking. Chinese automotive tech will eventually penetrate North America. Whether through joint ventures, technology licensing, or component assembly routed through Mexico. But here is the real twist. When a commercial truce is eventually struck, and this technology fully integrates into the North American landscape, the legacy Detroit giants won't be the ones taking the biggest hit. Why? Because incumbents like Ford and GM can retreat to defend their highly profitable full-size pickup segments, while simultaneously striking technology partnerships for their passenger EV lines. Ford is already deploying catalyst cell technology for its domestic battery production. Business is practical. If you can't beat them, you partner with them to protect your margins. Combined with Tesla's strong domestic position, American automakers will find ways to adapt and survive. So who gets squeezed out? It is the Japanese automakers. Look closely at who currently dominates the middle-class commuter and sedan segments across the US: Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. They maintain a strong position in the hybrid market, largely because the broader consumer shift is still playing out, and Washington still values Tokyo as a key geopolitical anchor in East Asia. But when cost-competitive, highly digitalized powertrain options enter the arena, they will compete directly for the market share that Japanese brands spent decades building in North America. That is where the historical loop closes. The very market dynamics that enabled Japan's rise will oversee its displacement. Japan originally capitalized on a Western energy shock to challenge Detroit. Down the road, as global supply chains renegotiate terms and establish new capital alignments, legacy players that were slow to embrace digitalized architectures will find their market share exposed. In the grand calculations of economic strategy, legacy concessions are often made to preserve larger trade balances. When major economic players remap industrial landscapes, smaller, dependent players frequently absorb the cost. This dynamic will likely define more than just the auto industry in the unfolding era of major power economic competition. That's all for our analysis today. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next installment.